Valentine's Day sees millions renew their affairs with chocolate. But with cocoa prices seesawing over supply and demand issues, will this be an even more expensive weekend for chocolate lovers? Joining me down the line to give a taste of his cocoa outlook is Edward George. Edward, in short term, we find ourselves on this Valentine's Eve, an internationally celebrated occasion. To what extent are these supply constraints going to be felt, and when? Are consumers going to find themselves paying over the odds?
Well, there certainly is a concern about a running down of stocks. According to the most recent data from the International Coffee Organization, stocks fell by 150,000 tons last season, and that was after a previous fall the season before. So there is definitely a rising deficit. You've got stocks down by nearly 10%, and also there's been a lot of concern by traders recently that the very strong crops in West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana were slowing down suddenly, and the smaller mid-crop may not be very good. And so there's a fear that there could suddenly be a slowdown in availability of beans, and that's what's really buoying prices. But when it comes to the cost of chocolate, the reality is that the vast majority of chocolate manufacturers are very careful about their pricing. Most of them identify a price point at which consumers can buy a bar of chocolate, and they try and keep that steady. And they assiduously look into this and research it and alter it according to purchasing power. So though you may not notice it as a consumer, over the course of 2 or 3 years when cocoa prices have gone up and gone down, you might still buy your bar of chocolate, but it might be slightly smaller, though it looks the same, or it might be that they've used a little less cocoa powder. They might have replaced some of the cocoa butter with vegetable oil. So ultimately, as a consumer, certainly this time round for this Valentine's, you shouldn't really notice a difference in the cost of chocolate. But in the medium to long term, absolutely, it could become something much more of a luxury and much more costly.
A cocoa industry group in Indonesia, the third biggest grower, last week said that output will probably drop to the lowest in a decade as rains hurt flowering and delay the harvest. They cited a great deal of demand, and any shortages will continue to keep the trade on the edge of their seats. They added futures prices still look poised for further moves, but we are edging closer to that long-awaited $3,000 mark. Are we likely to breach this threshold, do you think?
Well, we are nearly at $3,000 a ton at the moment, so I think it's quite likely that prices will go above that in the near future. If you think that they touched on 3,500 at the last peak in 2010 and significantly higher back in the mid-70s at the absolute cocoa peak. But a lot of the reason for this is because we're seeing some countries such as Indonesia sucking in more beans. The important thing is that the reason that Indonesia is going to have a lot less production available to the world is because it is eating up more of it with its grinding sector. It is the fastest growing grinding sector in the world. It's grown by 113% over the last 5 seasons and is now approaching around 300,000 tons per year of grind. That means it's going to overtake Brazil and Malaysia. And just like Brazil, even though it's a producer, it requires a lot more beans for its actual grinding sector. And so that's why you're going to see it becoming a net importer of beans for the first time this season, particularly as there's a smaller crop. That means less beans available to the international market and more focus on Africa as a source of raw beans.
In 2013 and 14, cocoa has been in deficit. According to some analysts, we are consuming more than farmers in Africa can actually grow and produce. Do you agree the chocolate shortage is a growing international issue and the shortage of available quality cocoa could last for years?
Well, I certainly think in the long term there is a major question mark hanging over the viability of the cocoa sector. Asian demand is growing so dramatically. Over the last 5 seasons, consumption or apparent consumption of cocoa in China and India rose by 15%. And in fact, it's now about half the level of all of the Americas put together. So as the Chinese and Indian consumers start to get a taste for chocolate and cocoa products, as they start to have more purchasing power and are able to spend on what is essentially a luxury, we're going to see a huge increase in consumption there. And the question is, can enough cocoa be produced in the world to meet this demand? Certainly, there have been huge advances in terms of improving yields. The vast majority of cocoa farmers in West Africa are smallholders with very small plots. They find it difficult to finance in order to get things like fertilizer and pesticide, and improved techniques for applying these newer varieties as well of cocoa trees, some of which are drought resistant, can hugely increase yields. So theoretically, Africa could easily produce twice as much cocoa on the same amount of land, but there are many obstacles in the way. In my view, what is of more concern to Africa is that there clearly seems to be a rise in grinding capacity elsewhere in the world, and in a sense, Africa is missing the boat. Its own grinding sector is big, but is very much stalled because there's uncertainty about its commercial viability. And if they're not going to move on this one fast, Africa could find itself missing the boat and ending up having to just supply raw cocoa to the world and allow other countries to extract the majority of the value. If you bear in mind, the average cost of a chocolate bar, as little as 8% of that actually goes to the cocoa farmer. Over 70% goes to the chocolate manufacturer and maybe 15% to the processor.
Edward, lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. Well, viewers, whether you're treating yourself or being treated to some chocolate, we hope you have a lovely Valentine's Day. But for me and for now, it's goodbye.